Hi everyone, I'm Ava and welcome back to your financial journey. Now, it seems like the only thing anyone's been talking about lately is tariffs. That President Trump is imposing tariffs, that tariffs are going to destroy the economy because we'll have to pay for all of them, or that no, it's the opposite, and that tariffs are going to save countless American jobs and our economy. With so much going on, and with so many conflicting opinions, it can be pretty hard to understand what tariffs actually are and the effects they may have on the broader economy, but also on our own lives. That's why in today's video, we'll have a look at the facts and explain what tariffs are. Specifically, we'll be answering these 3 questions. 1. What are tariffs and why do governments collect them? 2. How does a tariff work in real life? 3. Who ultimately pays for the tariffs? There's a lot to cover about tariffs, so let's get started. What are tariffs, and why do governments collect them? In its simplest form, a tariff is a tax on goods entering the country from a foreign nation, or on an import. The importer, the person buying a good from a foreign country, then has to pay not only the original cost of what they're buying, but the tariff as well. For example, let's say you're a U.S. customer living in Raleigh, North Carolina, and you're buying a $100 smartphone that was produced in Malaysia. Without any tariffs, you'd have to pay just those $100 for your smartphone. However, if the U.S. government decided to impose a tariff on goods imported from Malaysia, you'd have to pay the tariff too. Let's say the tariff rate is 30%. That means you'd have to pay an additional 30% of the smartphone's value, which in this case would be $30. And that means that instead of just paying $100 for your smartphone, you'd have to pay a total of $130. The original $100 to the Malaysian manufacturer, plus the additional $30 for the tariff the US government would collect. By the way, tariffs might be on everyone's lips now, but they're far from a new idea. Governments all over the world have been using them for years, and even centuries. In fact, the oldest recorded tariffs can be traced back to the city-states of Mesopotamia about 4,000 years ago. Given that governments have been using tariffs for thousands of years and are still enthusiastic about them today, there's probably some purpose behind it. And in general, there are 6 key reasons why governments love and impose tariffs. First, tariffs can generate government revenue. People have to pay the government extra fees when they import goods, which can bring in more money to be used for public services, defense spending, or other purposes. The second reason governments might impose tariffs is because tariffs allow for lower taxes. The revenue that tariffs generate may allow the government to collect lower tax rates for its domestic companies and citizens. Although, of course, this is because those lower rates are offset by an additional tax placed elsewhere in the form of tariffs. Third, tariffs might be used to protect domestic jobs and industries. Because tariffs make imported goods more expensive, they make it easier for local and domestic businesses to compete, which also helps keep jobs in the country. Which brings us nicely to the 4th reason governments might impose tariffs. Tariffs can encourage domestic production. Beyond just protecting domestic jobs, they can also promote new growth in certain industries, as people will try to replace more expensive foreign goods with cheaper local ones. That can also help reduce a country's reliance on foreign goods. 5th, tariffs can be used as a bargaining tool. Countries often negotiate trade deals or agreements with other countries to boost their economies, and they can use tariffs, or sometimes even just the threat of tariffs, to push for a better deal or to punish another country's unfair trade practices. And the 6th and final reason, governments might use tariffs to boost national security. For some important materials, like steel or critical minerals, a government might not want to be too dependent on a foreign country to get them. So, they might impose tariffs on that material to limit the influence that other countries have in controlling those strategic resources. As you can see, Tariffs can be a useful tool under some circumstances. But as the saying goes, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And when it comes to their downsides, there are 5 main disadvantages tariffs can have. The first disadvantage, and probably the one you've heard the most, is that tariffs can lead to higher prices for consumers. Tariffs increase the cost of imported goods, and in today's interconnected world, almost every good is imported or contains at least some parts that are imported. As a result, consumers often end up paying more as companies raise prices to offset the costs of tariffs. And if prices go up across many products, we get inflation. The second disadvantage is that tariffs can result in limited choices. That's because they can reduce the variety of products available in the market. A third disadvantage is that tariffs can cause other countries to retaliate with tariffs of their own. Tariffs might reduce the amount one country imports, again by making imports more expensive and thus discouraging them, but that means less exports and less profit for another country. And more often than not, other countries aren't too happy with measures that reduce their own profits, so they might respond with their own tariffs. That can reduce the amount the original country exports or sells abroad, which can reduce its own profits and even lead to a trade war that hurts global trade. That brings us to our fourth disadvantage. Tariffs can hurt global supply chains. Again, in today's linked world, products are often made with parts from multiple countries. Tariffs can disrupt these supply chains and thus increase production costs. Fifth, and finally, tariffs might harm domestic industries that rely on imports. Companies that need imported materials, like sushi shops needing imported fresh fish, face higher costs, which can affect their profitability and lead to jobs being lost and businesses going bankrupt in those industries. In a way, a government deciding whether a tariff makes sense or not in any specific situation is a bit like a doctor prescribing a medicine. The potential healing properties need to be balanced with the side effects, so to speak. For example, should a country look more at the helping hand that a tariff can give to its domestic producers, or should it be more concerned about keeping prices low for its citizens? Again, just like for medicine, a lot also depends on the amount prescribed. How large should the dosage be, or how high should the tariff rates go? So now that you know the 6 key reasons why governments love and impose tariffs, as well as the 5 main disadvantages tariffs can have, let's move on to the next tariff question for today. How does a tariff work in real life? Now, you might think that this sounds good, but a bit abstract. So to make things more tangible, let's follow our hypothetical smartphone on its way from the factory in Malaysia to you, the US consumer in Raleigh, North Carolina, with, again, a hypothetical tariff rate of 30%. Here are the 7 key steps our smartphone would go through before it can get to you in the US. Step 1. The smartphone would be produced in the factory in Malaysia, owned by an independent manufacturer, for the equivalent of $100. Step 2. The manufacturer would hand the phone over to the importer. In this case, that's you, because we've assumed in this illustration that you're buying the smartphone directly from the factory in Malaysia. But in real life, it could be another department of the manufacturer itself, a middleman like an independent trading house, or maybe a retailer that wants to sell the phone to customers in the US. Whoever the importer is in real life, though, the manufacturer would probably put the phone, together with thousands of other new phones, in a container and onto a ship before sending it to the port of Los Angeles. Step 3. While the phones are on the ship, you, or the importer, would already file the paperwork for the planned import of the phones with US Customs and Border Protection, or US Customs for short. This is done electronically and gives all the required details for the goods on the ship. That is, what the goods are, where they were made, what their content and components are, and, importantly, what their value is. Step 4. Once the container arrives in Los Angeles, Agents of U.S. Customs would document its arrival and then review and approve the electronic paperwork that you already filed while the goods were on the ship. In most cases, this customs approval is done without inspecting the goods in person, because the volume of imports into the U.S. is just too large for U.S. Customs to send an agent to have a look at every single shipment that arrives in the U.S. However, there might be spot checks and on-site inspections if anything sounds suspicious. Think of it as a bit like the customs check after you've returned from a foreign country to the U.S. at an airport and are collecting your luggage. Most passengers are waved through, but a few might have their luggage open for closer inspection. It's the same for imports that arrive in the U.S. in bulk. Step 5. After U.S. Customs has approved the smartphones, they're cleared to enter the U.S. Goods that are imported to the U.S. can be stored in warehouses or be sent directly to the purchaser. And in our case, let's assume that the container with your smartphone is put on a train and sent directly to you in Raleigh, North Carolina. Step 6. At the same time as Step 5, you, or the importer, would calculate the tariffs that are due and pay them to U.S. Customs, either electronically or by check. In our case, you'd have to declare the value of the smartphone as $100, apply the 30% tariff rate, and pay $30 electronically to U.S. Customs within a required time frame, which is usually 10 or 30 days. An important note is that the government relies on the importer to declare, calculate, and pay the tariff correctly. At this point, U.S. Customs does not check whether the amount that the importer pays is correct. However, they might later conduct investigations or audits to make sure everything was correct, much like the IRS will audit some taxpayers every year. And as a side note, because customs declarations are complex, some companies don't have their own employees to do it, but instead hire specialized customs brokers to guide them through the process. Step 7. Once the duties have been paid here, our smartphone would have at last reached this final step. It has successfully entered the U.S. and makes its way to you in Raleigh, North Carolina. You can finally use your smartphone to your heart's content. Or, if you're trying to earn a profit, you can sell it to a willing buyer. But that leads us to the next question for today's video. Who ultimately pays for the tariffs? Now that we understand how tariffs work, let's tackle the question of who actually pays for them in the end. Because while the importer is clearly the one who pays the tariff, the actual fee, directly to the government, the question of who ultimately shoulders the cost, the end consumer, the manufacturer, or the importer or retailer, can be harder to answer. Let's go back to our previous example of the smartphone shipped in from Malaysia to see who ultimately bears the cost under different tariff scenarios. In this column, we'll list out the different tariff scenarios. In this column is the price of the smartphone for a customer. In this column is the amount that the manufacturer earns. In this column is the amount that the importer or retailer earns, and in this column is the tariff amount that U.S. Customs collects. Scenario 1 is our standard no tariffs scenario. Let's say that you import a smartphone for $100 and sell that smartphone to a U.S. customer at a price of $150. From this $150, you then pay the manufacturer in Malaysia $100, and as the importer or retailer, you keep $50. With no tariffs, U.S. Customs wouldn't collect anything. So this is 0 here. Now, let's say that all of a sudden, new tariffs are imposed. And again, let's keep to our earlier example and assume that there is a tariff of 30% on the price of imported goods. If the imported value of the smartphone is $100, that would equal $30 of tariffs per smartphone, which would then need to be paid out to U.S. Customs. Now, there are 4 ways this could play out. With these new 30% tariffs, one option, on the extreme end, would be to just add the full $30 of tariffs to the price that the customer pays. This might be the case when the product being sold is superior to its nearest competitors, or even has no alternatives. So the retailer feels they have the pricing power to increase prices to the new level. This means that the new price of the smartphone to the customer would be $180, up from the old price of $150 in the no tariff scenario. The manufacturer in Malaysia would still earn $100, and you, as the importer, would also still earn $50 in this instance. But now, U.S. Customs would get $30 of tariffs paid to them. Under this scenario, the customer is the one who ultimately bears the full cost of the tariff. And the third option, which is on the other extreme end, you as the retailer absorb or swallow the cost of the new tariff and leave the price for the customer unchanged. This is often the way things go when the product in question is easily replaceable by a competitor's offering, and the retailer feels they don't have the pricing power to charge more. This means that the price of the smartphone to the customer would be $150, the same as it was under the no tariff scenario. Similarly, the manufacturer would earn $100, also the same as under the no tariff scenario. And U.S. Customs would get the same $30 of tariffs paid to them as here. But in this case, you, as the importer, would only earn $20 versus the $50 under these first two scenarios. That's a sizable decrease. Moving on to the next option, if there's tariffs, is that the retailer has the manufacturer fully absorb the price of the tariffs. This would be similar to this option here, in that the price for the customer would be unchanged at $150 per smartphone. You, as the importer, would also earn the same $50 per smartphone sold that you would have made before tariffs, which would leave a total of $100 for both the manufacturer and U.S. Customs. That means the manufacturer's share of the sale would have to shrink from $100 down to $76.92. And U.S. Customs would now collect a 30% tariff on the smartphone's new value of $76.92, which would equal $23.08, down from the $30 they would collect here. These two numbers equal $100. Now, this option of passing on the cost of the tariff to the manufacturer is only possible if you, as the importer, are an important enough customer to the manufacturer that you're able to negotiate with them for a lower price for the product. If you have enough pricing power as the manufacturer's customer. So basically, the customer, the importer or retailer, and the manufacturer are the three groups that might have to shoulder the cost of tariffs. So the fourth and final scenario is when the pain, the new cost of tariffs, is spread out across all the parties involved in the transaction, with each group paying their share. This will often be the case if all the parties feel they have a bit of pricing power, but not too much. To illustrate how that might work, let's say that in our case, you and the manufacturer are each willing to absorb $10 of the new tariff. That would bring the manufacturer's earnings down to $90. The $100 they would have earned before, minus the $10 of tariffs they'd pay. And your earnings down to $40, which again would be what you earned before, $50, minus the $10 of tariffs you'd pay. With this arrangement, U.S. Customs would have its take slightly reduced as well, because the 30% tariff would now be calculated on the new $90 import value of the smartphone instead of the original $100, resulting in a lower tariff cost of $27 instead of $30. And if we add all these numbers up, $90 for the manufacturer, $40 for you as the retailer, and $27 for U.S. Customs, the new price a retail customer would pay for a smartphone would be $157. A bit more than the original price of $150 before tariffs, but only by $7. From this example, which is already pretty simplified, we can see that the impact new tariffs have on the price that the end consumer pays depends on a number of factors, and that it's really not possible to generalize the effects tariffs will have. Too much depends on the specific circumstances for a product and/or industry. In real life, the last option is often the most likely outcome, with the cost of new tariffs being spread across the parties in a transaction. That's especially true for large and competitive markets like the US, where there's always at least a bit of competition that often prevents retailers from just passing the full cost of new tariffs on to customers. And our example with just 3 groups already makes things much simpler. In real life, there can be countless buyers and resellers along the way who further impact the way a tariff is paid. So, going back to our question, who ultimately pays for the tariffs? Like we said, there are no guarantees, and different products will probably react differently to tariffs, depending on the circumstances and the pricing power of the parties involved. But often, the cost of tariffs isn't shouldered by any single group, but shared by multiple parties involved. That's all we have in today's video about tariffs. We hope you learned something new and have a better understanding of how tariffs work for the next time you see something about them in the news. Because while it might not be certain who will pay for all these new tariffs being imposed everywhere, it does seem pretty certain that more action with tariffs is going to come. What do you think about tariffs? Leave a comment below and let us know. If you're interested in learning more about one of the most powerful players in our country's tariff negotiations, check out this video here on U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.